Hi and welcome to another story, and today we have part 10 of Candyfloss by Jacqueline Wilson, continuing from chapter 19. What are we going to do with you while I'm working in Billy's chip van every evening, said Dad. I suppose I should get a babysitter. Come off it, Dad, I said. I'm not a baby. I could maybe ask Miss Davis. Dad, she'd cluck her teeth at me and feed me birdseed sandwiches. There's old Ron. He's a weird old chap, but he's harmless, and he thinks the world of you, Floss. I don't want old Ron looking after me. He can't look after himself. I suppose I could ask if you could stay at Susan's once or twice. I'd like that. But I can't ask them to have you every night. Dad paused. Rhiannon's mum was at me the other day outside the school. I'm not going to Rhiannon's, Dad. OK, Dad sighed. Well, what are we going to do with you, Sugar Lump? We don't have to do anything. I'll stay here at Billy's. I can't leave you all on your own, pet. Of course you can. I'll be fine. I'll read and I'll watch Billy's telly and I'll sew clothes and then when I get tired I'll go to bed. Simple. But what if someone came to the door? I won't answer it. I'm not daft, Dad. I'm sure it's against the law leaving a kid your age on her own, Dad said anxiously. Who's going to know? Only us, I said. Dad, please don't worry about me. I'll be fine. I just about had him convinced. I thought I had myself convinced too, but when it was time for Dad to go out on Monday night, I wasn't so sure. I'll be fine, I kept saying. Yes, of course you'll be fine, Dad kept repeating, giving me a last kiss, a last cuddle, and a last ruffle of the curls. Then he went out to work. The front door shut behind him and I started to feel scared. I was watching a film on television and it was meant to be funny, but there were two creepy men chasing after this little kid, so I had to switch it off quick. I sat in the sudden silence, ears straining, listening out for creepy men breaking into the house, coming to get me. Billy's parents frowned out of their wedding photo at me, not liking a stranger sitting cross-legged on their faded old carpet. The house was still filled with their things. Maybe they were still here too. Hiding in a dusty cupboard, whispering to each other. When it got dark, they'd drift out into the room, silent on their see-through ghost feet. I desperately wanted to cuddle Lucky for comfort, but she'd gone upstairs to loll on her duvet, and I couldn't face those creaky stairs by myself. I tried calling her, but the thin sound of my own voice was so strange in the silent house that I clapped my hands over my mouth. Then I heard it, the gate creaking. Someone walking up the garden path. I sat rigid on the old sofa, waiting. I heard them outside the door. They didn't knock. There were scrambling sounds. Then I heard the door opening. They were coming right in. They were coming down the hall, ready to get me. Floss! Flossie, love! Oh, Dad, I said. I gave a shaky cartoon laugh. Hey, what are you doing back home? I know it's daft. I know you're perfectly fine here by yourself. Yes, Dad. But I couldn't stand it. I kept imagining stuff. I know it's mad, pet, but would you mind coming in the chip van with me? OK, Dad. I am fine here, but if it'll put your mind at rest, then I'll come too. Let's go, I said, scooting off the sofa and hanging onto his arm. We started up a whole new routine. Every evening I set off with Dad in our van. We'd go to the big garage behind the station, hook the chip van up and tow it into the station forecourt. Then Dad would start the generator and get the fryer heated up while I squashed up in a cramped but cosy nest in the corner of the van, out of sight of the customers. I had 2 cushions and Dad's old denim jacket to snuggle up in. I didn't need to wear any kind of coat. It was boiling hot in the van from the fryer with its sizzling fat. I did my homework first, except when it was maths, which I needed to do before school with Susan. Then I read for a bit. I started reading all those old Victorian Sunday school books from Billy's house. They were told in a strange old-fashioned way, but the stories were really good once you got into them. They were all about poor, ragged children begging in the streets of London. They often had cruel, drunken stepfathers and sickly little baby brothers and sisters. They sometimes coughed a lot, and then said they saw angels, and then they died. I read some of the best bits to Dad in between customers. Aren't these stories a bit morbid for you, Floss? Said Dad. They certainly give me the willies. I like them, Dad, I said. When people started coming out of pubs, it got too busy and noisy to concentrate on my books, so I made things instead. I made a friendship bracelet for Susan, several friendship bracelets. I made a Scooby-Doo keyring for Dad. I fashioned slightly wonky denim jackets for Ellerina and Dimble. I made a little blue denim mouse with a string tail for Lucky. I tried taking Lucky to the van with us one day, but it was much too hot and cramped for her, and she hated it. She seemed much happier left at home. She couldn't care less about creepy men and sad old ghosts. Dad would give me a little paper plate of chips every now and then, or a can of Coke, but I couldn't drink too much because there was nowhere I could go to the loo. After a while I'd start to get achy and my legs would itch, so I'd put my sewing stuff away and plump up my cushions and rub my cheek against Dad's old jacket and go to sleep. Then at midnight Dad would tow the chip van back to the garage, lift me up into our van and drive us home. I'd tumble into bed half asleep, one arm out of the covers, so I could still reach down and stroke Lucky. Dad still worried about me being in the van. Your mum would go mad if she knew I was keeping you up till all hours, he said. It's not suitable, I know, especially when all the lads start coming out of the pubs and get a bit mouthy. The language. I think we'll have to put earmuffs on you, little Floss. I'd learned a few amazingly awful phrases, which came in useful when Rhiannon and Margot and Judy were teasing me. They held their noses all the time when I came near. I knew I did smell chippier than ever, but I pretended not to care. I did try very hard the next Saturday when I went to spend the day with Susan. I got up early and had a bath, although the peeling enamel scratched my bottom. I shampooed my hair as best I could and then tried to brush out all the tangles. My curls had grown a lot. They stuck all around my head in a mad fuzz. I wore my birthday jeans and top and I cleaned my trainers. Dad made a big effort too. He put on his blue shirt and his best jeans, even though he was just going to loaf around at home for the rest of the day. He drove me to Susan's house. I was worried that it was going to be a huge great mansion with beautiful polished furniture and very pale sofas and carpets, and I'd have to sit on the very edge of my seat and not eat or drink anything slurpy in case I spilled it. It was a relief to see that it was an ordinary red brick Victorian villa. When I got inside I saw it was gloriously untidy, with shoes all over the hall and papers and files stacked high by the phone and books everywhere. Not just on the bookshelves, but in higgledy-piggledy piles all over the carpet, and climbing up the stairs and stacked hallway, up each windowsill. There were books in the lavatory, books in the bathroom, and books all over the kitchen, stuffed in between the saucepans and the spice jars. The kitchen seemed to be the main Potts living room. There was a television on the dresser, and fat velvet cushions scattered over the benches on either side of the long table. The actual living room was turned into a huge library study, with Mrs. Potts and her computer and desk and filing cabinet one end, and Mr. Potts and his computer and desk and filing cabinet the other. They had the big bedroom upstairs. Susan had a very little bedroom, with a pine bed and a patchwork quilt, and a special shelf for her elephants and giraffe and crocodiles and rabbits. The middle-sized bedroom was Susan's study. She had her own computer and desk, and filing cabinet, and masses of books on shelves, and drawings and posters, and maps, blue-tacked all over the walls. It's so lovely, Susan, I said, tiptoeing around, peering at a book here, a picture there. You've got so many things. I wondered, would you like to make another book world like we did in the library at school, Susan asked. Oh, yes, I said. I watched as Susan eagerly started getting books down from shelves and tipping out a stack of wooden building bricks all over the wooden floor with a great clatter. Won't your mum mind us making such a mess? I asked. She doesn't mind a bit if we're being creative, said Susan. Creative? You know, making things up and being artistic. I can do that, I said. So we were happily creative most of the morning, building a land for all Susan's animals. We made a book mountain, and I had the elephants plodding up it, tail to trunk, led by a little Roman toy soldier that Susan called Hannibal. We made a river out of blue and green books, edged with potted ferns and ivy from the kitchen windowsill. The 2 crocodiles lurked in the river, jaws ready to start snapping. We made Hannibal have a paddle, and then run away screaming. The giraffe came to have a drink and had a tasty fern sandwich, garnished with ivy salad. The pink and blue rabbits had a frolic too, and we sat the giant green one on top of the mountain as a monument. We could really do with some more people, I said. Do you have any plasticine? No, but I've got modelling clay. Will that do? Said Susan. It did wondrously. We made a little Roman army for Hannibal to command, and some pilgrim worshippers to kneel at the paws of the giant green rabbit. We made twin giraffe babies for the big giraffe, and lots of tiny baby rabbits for Mrs. Pink and Mr. Blue Bunny. We made half a person, screaming in the river, with a severed leg in each crocodile's jaw. We had great fun acting it all out, but I was still a bit worried about the mess, especially as we'd accidentally smeared modelling clay all over the floorboards. However, when Susan's mum came to see what we were up to, she was so pleased by our bookland that she actually took photos of it. She took photos of us too, with our arms round each other, and promised I could have copies of all of them. Then we went in the kitchen with Susan's mum to watch her prepare lunch. Though I know I'm not as good a cook as your father, Floss, said Mrs. Potts, Susan adores his chip sandwiches. Butties, Mum, said Susan. My dad's butties are famous, I said. I started talking about the cafe without thinking, and then suddenly shut up. It was so awful to think that it didn't exist anymore. It had been my home ever since I was born. They hadn't just closed it down. When Dad drove me past on the way to school, we saw someone had taken down the Harley's Cafe sign. They were workmen in there stripping out the kitchen, tearing everything down. I felt as if they were tearing up all my happy memories too. I didn't say anything, and neither did Dad, but the next day he drove me to school, all around the outskirts of town, so we didn't have to go past. Susan's mum saw I looked a little bit sad. How about you two doing a bit of cooking too? Have you ever done any baking, Floss? I've made toffee and cornflake crispies and chocolate biscuit cake with Mum, I said. My voice wobbled when I said her name. I think I must have looked even sadder because Mrs. Potts put her arm around me. I wonder if you've ever made bread, she said. This was a wonderful idea. It was fascinating, creaming the yeast, with Mrs. Potts explaining exactly how it worked. Susan helped me measure out the flour accurately. The best bit was the kneading part. I got dough right up to my elbows, so it looked as if I was wearing thick white gloves. I made one loaf and Susan made another. They started to smell utterly delicious as they were baking in the oven, and when at last it was time to take them out, they looked wonderful, golden brown with a lovely crust. One had risen just a little higher out of the baking tin and was just a little bit more glossy and golden. Susan and Mrs. Potts said it was my loaf. I rather think it was, too. You've obviously got a real knack as a baker, Floss, said Mrs. Potts. Next time you come, you can try making rolls. If only we still had the cafe, then I could make newly baked rolls for Dad's chips, and we could be a brilliant chip-butty partnership, I said. It wouldn't work for the chip van. There wasn't space to do anything properly. Dad's chips weren't quite the same anyway. He used the same type of potatoes, the same cooking fat, but Billy's fryer was old and unpredictable. Sometimes the chips burned to a frazzle. Sometimes they swam limply like white fish in a fatty sweet sea, taking an age to crisp up. Dad did his best, but he couldn't serve his chips with pride. He didn't care for the burgers and sausages he served up either. He didn't have any complaints, though. The big lads pouring out of the pubs just wanted something hot and savoury to stuff down their throats. They covered everything in blood-red tomato sauce or bright yellow mustard anyway. Dad says his chip butties aren't up to scratch any more, I said sadly. Well, I shall always remember mine as the most sublime culinary experience ever, said Susan. I didn't understand every word she said, but I knew what she meant and smiled at her gratefully. We'd had our homemade bread at lunchtime, with cheese and tomatoes and salad, and then Greek yoghurt and honey for pudding. Susan's mum told us all about proteins and carbohydrates and vitamins, and Susan's dad told us all about Greece and how bees make honey. I tried hard to ask intelligent questions like Susan, and then ended up giving myself hiccups. Susan's mum told me exactly what little thingy inside me had gone into a spasm and why. Susan's dad told us about some wretched man in Scotland who hiccuped for 2 years solid. I started to worry I might be an even more wretched girl in England, fated to hiccup her way through life forever. But Susan suddenly leaned forward across the table and shouted, "Boo!" I jumped. "I bet you can't hiccup any more now," Susan said. And she was right. We'd have been very happy to play back in Susan's study all afternoon, but Mr. and Mrs. Potts felt we should go on an outing. They drove us to Hampton Court Palace because Henry VIII had once lived there, and Susan and I were doing the Tudors in history. Henry VIII had had 6 wives. Susan's dad told us the names and what happened to them all. Henry divorced his first wife, Catherine. My dad divorced my mum. I imagined what it would be like if he got through 5 more wives. There were actors dressed up as Elizabethans inside Hampton Court. They gave a talk, and then you could ask them questions. Susan asked all sorts of interesting things about beheadings and religion and music. Mr. and Mrs. Potts pretended not to notice, but I could see they were bursting with pride. "You can ask a question too, Floss," Mrs. Potts whispered. I couldn't think of anything intelligent to ask whatsoever. "Go on, dear, don't be shy," said Mrs. Potts. I ended up asking the lady how she got her sticky-out skirt to stay all puffed up. "It's called a farthingale, Floss," Mr. Potts hissed. I think he was scared they thought I might be his daughter too. The lady didn't seem to think it too silly a question. She held up her skirts so I could see the weird hooped petticoats underneath. We went all over the palace, and Mr. and Mrs. Potts told us heaps of stuff about the Tudors. Susan was obviously fascinated, but I started having terrible yawning fits because it got so boring. I tried to keep my mouth shut when I yawned, but my eyes watered. Perhaps Mrs. Potts thought I was crying. She put her arm around me. "I know what Flossie would like to see. The Tudor kitchen," she said. "Let's go there next." The kitchen was quite interesting, but I so wished Susan and I could have just dawdled around there by ourselves. The very best bit of Hampton Court trip was going to the maze. Susan's dad had told us the story about some monster called the Minotaur, so we pretended we were running away from this Minotaur. We ran, screaming around and round the pass between the high hedges, and every time we came to a dead end and had to turn on our tracks, we'd yell, "The Minotaur! The Minotaur!" We played we were diving between his cloven hooves or jumping high over his scaly back. Mr. Potts said we'd got the legend wrong and started to tell us all about it all over again, but Mrs. Potts laughed and told him to lighten up. "The girls are just having a little bit of fun," she said, giving Susan's hand a squeeze. "We're having lots and lots and lots of fun," Susan shouted, her cheeks pink, her eyes shining behind her little glasses. Mr. Potts smiled at her and held her other hand. Susan jumped up and down between her mum and her dad. The back of my throat went tight. My whole head started throbbing. I'd have given anything in the whole world to hang on to my mum and dad's hands, and for us to be a family altogether. Then Susan let go of her parents and took my hand. We ran off again, and suddenly, without even trying, we reached the clearing in the middle of the maze. So we danced around and around in celebration. Chapter 20. Mum phoned on Sunday morning. She wanted to know so many worrying details about the cafe and what was happening. I didn't know what to say. I started telling her all about Susan instead, and wonderfully she got sidetracked for a while. Then she started telling me about this outing they'd had to a special fish restaurant on the waterfront. I bet the chips weren't as good as Dad's chips, I said. They didn't serve anything as common as chips there, Floss. This was an extremely upmarket place, said Mum. But talking of chips, there was an old man at the next table who was the spitting image of that weird old man who haunts your dad's cafe. You know, the one who had that awful chip van. Your dad calls him Billy the Chip. It couldn't possibly have really been him, not in an ultra-stylish restaurant the other side of the world, and yet he was looking at me as if he recognised me too. Gosh, Mum, how strange, I said. Look, I'd better go now. I'll be late for school. Floss, it's Sunday. What? Oh, yes. Well, my new friend Susan's coming round soon, so I must get ready. Love you. Bye, Mum, I gabbled, and then I slammed the phone down. Mum saw Billy, I said to Dad. Oh, God. He didn't tell her about the cafe closing, did he? Oh, Floss, I feel so bad putting you in this position. Maybe we should tell your mum the truth, but then she'd go spare. Dad put his head in his hands. She'll go double spare with knobs on when she gets back and finds out we've been camping at Billy's. If we're still here. Dad, don't. We'll sort Mum out, I said quickly. Let's have a happy Sunday. We can go for a drive in the van. Certainly, beloved daughter. We'll have a happy Sunday, said Dad. We drove around in the van for ages. Dad had made enough out of Billy's chip van to buy a full tank of petrol. We drove right out into the country, and then round and round every little town and village. We always slowed down going past any posters and big fields and parks and recreation grounds. We didn't once say the word fair to each other, but we both knew what we were looking for. We didn't have any luck. We came home feeling a bit frazzled. Of course it wasn't home. Still, Dad did his best. He'd bought a packet of crumpets, and we stuck them on a big fork and toasted them in front of Billy's old electric fire in the living room. Lucky and whiskey and soda came and basked in the heat on the rug. Lucky lay in between whiskey and soda. They took turns nuzzling and petting her, trying to outdo each other as foster mums. Lucky smiled to herself, happy to be the centre of attention. All three cats eventually narrowed their eyes, lowered their heads, and started napping. I was tired too, but I had to go off to the chip van with Dad. I washed my buttery crumpet hands carefully because I wanted to make some more clothes for Ellerina and Dimble. I filled a carrier bag with material scraps and some tissues and toothpicks and some cut-up socks for stuffing. I fancied making them proper Tudor outfits, complete with petticoats and pleated ruffs. I didn't have the first idea how to go about this, but I hoped inspiration would strike once I got cracking. Dad and I set off to the station. Dad manoeuvred the chip van out into the forecourt and got everything set up. The chip fryer was being particularly temperamental, overheating one minute and switching itself off the next. Dad fiddled and swore at it, despairing. How am I supposed to cook anything halfway decent on this ropey old contraption, he said. Oh, Flossie, Charlie's cafe was hardly the Ritz, but at least I could cook properly back at home. Try as I might, I can only manage rubbish food here. For a long time it didn't look as if anyone wanted any food, rubbish or otherwise. We'd been busy on Saturday night, and Dad had whistled as he fried, happy that he was keeping Billy's business going and making a bit of cash for us. But this Sunday we weren't making any cash at all. Dad sighed and fidgeted and shook the short, surly fryer. Then he came and squatted down beside me, his knees uncomfortable under his chin because he was so big and there was very little space. What's that you're doing, sweetheart? He asked, watching me gluing bits of white tissue to the toothpicks. I'm trying to make one of those sticky-out hoop petticoat thingies to go under an Elizabethan gown for my woolly elephant, I said. Dad blinked. Ask a silly question, he said. He reached out and ruffled my curls. You're a funny kid, Floss. Thank God you're so adaptable. Well, I'll keep the blooming fryer bubbling the other half hour or so, and then we might as well call it a day. The town's dead, obviously. Almost as soon as Dad said that, a couple fetched up at the van and started tapping their money on the counter for attention. Then another couple, a little gang of girls, a rowdy mob of boys. So, where have you guys all suddenly sprung from, said Dad, heaving masses of chips into the fryer. Oh, there's been a green fair down by the river, said one of the girls. We've been listening to the bands. Oh, Dad, the fair, I said, leaping up. It won't be our fair, pet. Green fairs are different, said Dad. You cuddle down on your cushion and try to go to sleep. It looks like it's going to be a long and busy night after all. We're not going to get home till late." I tried to finish Ellerina's petticoat first, but it totally defeated me. I ended up with little pricks all over my fingers and bits of tissue stuck everywhere. I gave up and had a go at making those baggy knicker things that Elizabethan men wore, but it was difficult fashioning them to fit a saggy woolen dog, so I stopped trying. Maybe Susan would have to be a chief dressmaker in our games. I curled up in a ball, closed my tired, itchy eyes, and tried to go to sleep. But it wasn't easy. It got noisier and noisier as more and more people came to the chip van on their way home from the fair. I started dreaming a silly dream about wandering around Hampton Court with Ellerina and Dimble dressed as Tudor courtiers. I'd somehow turned into one of the Henry VIII's 6 wives, only he decided he didn't like me any more, and he started shouting at me. I ran away because I knew what happened to the wives who were out of favour. Then all his soldiers started pursuing me. They were all shouting too. I woke up with a start, still shaking. I told myself that it was only a dream, that I was safe in the chip van with Dad, but I could still hear the shouting. I heard Dad shouting too. I struggled up out of the corner. Dad, what's happening? Are you all right? Get back down, darling, it's okay. It's just some silly lads getting impatient. Pipe down, you guys. I'm frying as fast as I can. This isn't McDonald's. There's just me, so you'll have to wait. Stupid idiots, said this tall guy, who was waiting patiently, his arm around his girlfriend. Don't take any notice of that lot, mate. You're doing a grand job. I blinked, then rubbed the sleep out of my eyes. The tall guy was somehow familiar. He had long, fairish hair down to his shoulders, a black vest, black jeans and a studded jacket, and large silver biker jewellery on almost every finger. It's Saul, I said, bobbing up behind Dad. Get down, Floss. It's who? Saul. Saul saw me and grinned. Yeah, I'm Saul. How did you know my name? Is she an old girlfriend, Saul? Said his girl, grinning. Saul rescued us at the fair, Dad. Our fair. He's Rose's son. Oh, great, said Dad. Well, smashing to meet up with you again, Saul. Is the fair in the town again? No, I'm not actually with the fair at the moment. I've moved in with Jenny here, said Saul, giving her a squeeze. Stop the chit-chat, chip man, and get serving, some stupid guy yelled, his mates starting chanting stuff too. Yobbos, said Dad contemptuously, taking no notice of them. Well, I bet your mum misses you, Saul. Yeah, she wasn't too pleased, but she's a tough lady, my ma. She'll cope. She's a lovely lady, said Dad, serving up a mega huge portion of chips to Saul and Jenny. Here you are. Have these on the house. Thanks, mate. That's good of you. Fancy you working here in the chip van. It's just a temporary measure. Not quite sure what the future holds. Maybe I should go and see your mum and ask her to tell my fortune, said Dad. Here, chip man. Get serving us, you useless git. An ugly guy behind shouted. Keep your mouth buttoned, mate, until you learn some manners, said Saul. Yeah? So who's going to make me? I might, said Saul, clenching his ringed fingers so they were bunched in a threatening fist. Don't come the heavy with me, mate. Who do you think you are, with your girly hair and your jewellery? You're asking to be sorted out good and proper. The ugly guy surged forward, all his gang following. Now cut it out, lads. Any trouble, and I'm into that station and phoning the police, said Dad. No one was listening. They were pushing and shoving, shouting and swearing. Then the ugly guy punched Saul on the chin. Saul whacked him one straight back with a ringed fist. The ugly guy staggered, bleeding. He fumbled for something, and then I saw a sudden, frightened gleam. He's got a knife, I screamed. Oh, God, said Dad. Watch out, Saul. Look, you stay right here, where it's safe, Floss. Out of sight, promise. Dad squeezed my shoulder and then went rushing out of the door, at the back. Dad! Oh, Dad, come back! Don't get hurt! I couldn't stay in my corner. I had to peer over the counter to see what was happening. There were people fighting everywhere. Some lads were kicking. Someone was headbutting. I couldn't even see Saul and the ugly guy now. And where was Dad? I prayed he wouldn't get into the fight himself. What if he was hit or kicked? What if he was knifed? I eyed the door, wondering if I dare go out after him to drag him back, but I'd promised Dad to stay in the van. It wasn't safe any more, though. There were boys banging on it now, so that it rattled and shook. There were thumps and shoves. I cowered right up in the corner again, clutching Dimble and Ellerina. More fists, more boots. The van juddered and rocked and tilted. Let's turn it right over, someone shouted. Dad, I yelled. They all kicked together and the van lurched sideways. The chips sizzled furiously and fat poured out over the fryer. Then suddenly there was an enormous whoomph and flames leapt high in the air. Dad! 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 I screamed. I scrabbled for something to throw on the flames, but it was too late. They were roaring right up to the ceiling, terrifyingly orange, while filthy smoke swirled all around the van, making me cough. Dad! I croaked. The flames and fat were making such a noise no one would ever hear me. I had to get out. I couldn't even see the door now. I was in a boiling, burning whirl of black smoke and orange flame. My eyes smarted and stung. I couldn't breathe. I pressed my woolly toys over my nose and mouth and crouched down, crawling blindly across the floor. Dad! I cried one last time. Then the door burst open, making the fire roar and spread. There were arms fighting through the flames. 2 hands grabbed me and hauled. I was out of the van, still screaming and sobbing, but safe in Dad's arms. And that is where we'll leave part 10 of Candyfloss by Jacqueline Wilson. I'll be back soon with the next part of this fantastic story, and lots more stories and videos coming your way very soon. If you'd like to subscribe or hit a like, that's always appreciated, guys. Take care. Bye-bye.